Welcome to the London Business School webinar series, Leading Through a Pandemic. I'm Julian Birkinshaw. I'm a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship here at London Business School, and I will be your host throughout the series. Our purpose with these webinars is to give you some bigger picture perspectives on the challenges you face as business leaders. We've got a lineup of faculty experts, 2 every week, who are sharing their insights from their research as it applies to various aspects of leading through a pandemic. We want to enrich your understanding of what's happening and to give you some practical advice for how to run your business in these difficult times. It is a great pleasure to have Sir Andrew Likierman with us, our former Dean. Welcome, Andrew. And now a Professor of Management Practice. Before I introduce him properly, I would like to provide just one piece of framing relevant not just to today's webinar, but to, in fact, the entire series. So if we could put the slide up. Many of you will remember Donald Rumsfeld. Does that name ring a bell? He was the former US Secretary of Defense during the Iraq War. And he will be remembered probably mostly of all for one distinction he made between known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And he was ridiculed at the time for it, but of course, he actually had a very important point to make, which is the following, that there's a bunch of risks that we face in our lives, in our business lives, in our professional lives, in our personal lives, which are measurable. They are quantifiable. We can run analyses to predict the likelihood of certain things happening. We can buy insurance against all those things. And there's some I put up there, weather risks, currency risks, so default of suppliers. We can literally buy things called credit default swaps if we're worried about companies going out of business. All of these are things that you can put a value on, and they are in the category of known unknowns. Unfortunately, you then have this other category of things called unknown unknowns. And of course, we are living through one of those now. The COVID-19 pandemic is what we are living through. If you've got decent length memories, you will all remember, of course, the global financial crisis. You will remember 9/11. Some of you may go all the way back further to the collapse of the Berlin Wall. All of these were once in a generation or even once in a lifetime events. They could not be predicted. I'm not saying they couldn't have been imagined, but they couldn't have been predicted in any sort of way which would allow us to create sensible models around them. Some people have called these black swan events. The key point here is simply that we do not have a sort of a set of methods for analysing them sensibly. Where do these things arise from? We live in a complex world, a world where there are second and third and fourth order consequences of small changes in initial conditions which lead to things happening in ways that cannot possibly be foreseen. It's called the butterfly effect. Some of you heard that phrase before. Clearly, we've got the situation where something that happened in Wuhan is now a global pandemic. That is the butterfly effect in action. So these things can't be planned, but they can to some degree be managed in the circumstances. So how do we handle such things? We're going to be talking over the next few weeks about some of the methods that we can use. But to focus today's session, because all of these different black swan or unknown events are unpredictable, they all have their own particular qualities. There's no way that you can have thought through all of the contingencies around them. Those are the circumstances where judgment comes into play. Judgment is, and Andrew will talk about this in a bit more detail in a second, but judgment is literally when we are being asked to form views on things that we do not have complete data on. So today we are going to talk about judgment. Who better than to do this than Sir Andrew Likierman, whose big research project since he stepped down as Dean of London Business School 2.5 years ago is really on this question, what does judgment look like? So without further ado, Andrew, I'm going to hand the clicker to you. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. Please, the floor is yours. Give us some thoughts about the challenge of judgment.
Julian, thank you very much indeed. And hello, everybody, especially to alumni who I haven't seen in a while. I'm sorry, these are the circumstances in which we are re-establishing contact. We've got a couple of polls, and I'd like to start off, if I may, with the first one. Can we have the first poll, please? So the first poll really identifies what is it at the moment that is your biggest concern. I realise that all these, in a sense, are concerns, but it would be helpful, especially for the Q&A, just to get a bit of a sense of that. So the answers, pretty convincingly so far, is about the uncertainty about how long this will last. And I might have imagined that might be so. Thank you very much. That's fine. That, I think, gives us a help, in terms of saying, where do we go in the Q&A session? All right. So let me go into the subject itself. There are the big issues. Julian's referred to these. These are the kinds of things in our professional lives that we're looking at inevitably. There are many more issues of this kind. These are the big corporate issues, if you like. And then there are the personal issues that we've got in our own lives. These are things that many of us have had no opportunity to practice or have had before in our lives. And so we're faced very much with a set of uncertainties with which we've got to grapple. OK, before we start, can I just say a couple of things in terms of this particular subject that I'm talking about and the approach to it. First of all, I'll be talking about judgment. And by that, I mean good judgment. It's a shorthand. I'm talking about it as an important quality, but I well realise this is not, of course, the only thing you need in a crisis. Integrity, resilience, these are kinds of things that we're going to need in full measure during this crisis. So I'm talking about judgment not as an exclusive quality, as it were, but a very, very important one. What I'm saying is not intended to be something which is a blueprint. This is the way you do things. It's very much a guide, an approach to the way which we might do things. I also know that from the people listening today, you have very, very different circumstances. Some of you come from for-profit organisations, some not-for-profit organisations, large and small organisations. Some of you are affected directly by this crisis, others by others being affected by the crisis. There's a secondary effects. So I know that, therefore, there are many different sets of circumstances here, at home as well as at work. I also know, and this is something which I've learned from talking to alumni around the world, that cultures matter a great deal in the way these things are approached. So I'm well aware of the generalizations that I make do not necessarily apply in the same measure to every culture, but I hope a lot will be common. Above all, though, this session is not about, it's about how, not about what. And that's because the crisis is changing every day. For example, we know we've had 2 days with no deaths in Wuhan. Now, is that a blip or is this the end of the crisis? We don't yet know. In a week's time, we'll have a much better sense of that. Italy has clearly had a torrid time in this crisis. We don't know yet why Italy is so different. That's the kind of thing, again, which we'll get more information about over time. And then later today, the Chancellor will make announcements about the kind of support he's going to make to UK businesses. Again, that will change the game for a number of UK businesses. So you can see why, therefore, I'm talking about an approach to this crisis rather than what you do today, because what you do today may not be the same as what you need to do in the light of further information tomorrow. All right. This is about judgment. So what is judgment? There's the definition for you. It's the ability to combine personal qualities with the relevant knowledge and experience to form opinions and take decisions. And I'm going to focus mainly on decisions, although clearly we've all got to form opinions as well. And also thinking about the question of people, we're going to have to think quite a lot about people. Do we trust people in these circumstances? I'll be saying more about that in a moment. What is judgment? What comprises judgment? It combines a collection of qualities. It's a composite of all these things. So it's not a single element, it's many. A couple of things to say about it. This is not about being cautious. Judgment is about taking decisions in the right way at the right time, not taking no decision. It's not about being judgmental. Being judgmental is making a judgment on somebody which is the opposite of judgment. And also it's worth saying that the values one has are within this process, and I'll be explaining how that occurs. I mentioned already, I know that there are different cultures applying this in a different way. Okay. If you look at the bottom bar, at the moment, an awful lot of what we're doing and have to do is about judgment. And that's because we haven't got the relevant facts and data, because we haven't been in this position before. In 1 month, we'll be a lot better off. We have much more information in a month's time, and even more in 3 months' time. In 2 years' time, hopefully, we'll be looking back on this, learning the lessons and so on. But judgment is a very high proportion of what we need to exercise now, because we simply haven't got the precedent and the underlying facts and data to go on. You may say, all right, so can we measure judgment in terms of success? I'm afraid we can't. If we could, life might be a lot easier. But just to be clear, a lot of what judgment is about is also dependent on luck. I mean, the fact is, success, we know, depends on luck and on factors outside our control. Today especially, we have so many factors outside our control. We may also be taking a managed risk, which may involve failure because we took that managed risk. And in terms of data, we know that some data is partial. For example, the question of how many people have got the virus is unclear because the statistics are not being systematically collected in many countries. And some countries have not been very good in collecting that data. Also, in terms of linking judgment to success, we'll never know what the alternative might have been. Now, I point this out because we're talking here about a process, not about an outcome. Right, I'm going to finish on the general aspects now. Sorry, but just to say it's about stacking the cards in your favour. I'm going to finish about the general aspects before I move specifically onto coronavirus and what we can do about this in terms of a process. This is the framework that I've been working on, and it involves 6 elements which are the process of judgment. Number 1 is about what I take in. Julian mentioned that the chat facility, which was I saw Linda's webcast a couple of days ago, and I was quite distracted by those coming up on the bottom of the screen. You know, it made it difficult to take in what's going on. We vary in our ability to take in things. I mean, and we need to make sure we are taking in both what we hear and also what we read. The second element is who and what we trust. If one thinks about many people having to make statements in the light of very little information at this time, it is quite difficult to know who to trust, because although somebody may look great, they themselves may not know what the answers are. And if I just take one example of somebody who, certainly for me, exuded a great sense of trust last year, it was Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, in responding to the atrocity in Christchurch, the shooting in Christchurch. So trust is a second important element. The third one is what we know about this, not just about life in general, but about this. And as we know at the moment, we know quite little about this. We have, for example, people have their kids are coming home. They're going to have kids at home for the first time. How do we treat that? That's a completely new situation for many people about how one's going to cope with that. In terms of feeling and belief, number 4, what one judges is filtered through, that's why I put the dotted line there, one's beliefs and feelings. And if I just take an example here, one's attitude to this crisis is bound to be affected by one's attitude to health more generally. Some people are more relaxed about it and some people are more anxious. Number 5 is about choices. Now, for example, one may decide, should I work at home? Well, that's a choice. Maybe I decide I should work at home. On the other hand, delivery means, but can I work at home? Is it going to be possible with with the kids at home doing, for example, their lessons there. That's going to be a tough thing to do. That is the framework into which I'm going to put the coronavirus judgments that I'm going to be talking about. I should say two things. First of all, if we talk about feeling and belief, this also involves an attitude to risk. Some people today are more prepared to take risks and some less. Now, our attitude to risk is an essential part of what we feel and believe. The second one is about timing. Choices are also about timing. And we know at a fast evolving situation like this that timing is a very important element. Anyway, that's the framework. Just to be clear about some of the biases, this is the feelings and beliefs area. We know that all of us are subject to bias. And I've just picked out a few there in red, of which we've got to be, I think, particularly aware at this time. The first one is about analogy. Can we make an analogy between this and the other crises? The answer is no. It's not like anything else we've seen before. We know that. Systematic optimism or pessimism, we approach things with a different frame of mind. And again, we've got to be careful about that in terms of our underlying feelings about this crisis. Confirmation bias, are we looking for things simply to confirm what we already feel? We've got to be a bit cautious about that. Availability means taking in the latest bit of evidence we've got and giving that undue significance. And again, I think we've got to have a sense of the time scale under which we're looking at things. Small numbers, we don't have a big sample here. China is already being taken. Is this the model for the rest of us? Well, it may or may not be. By the time we're a month along, we'll have a lot more experience from a lot more countries to go on. And groupthink, it's quite tempting for us to sit around together and say, we know what we think. Well, we need to be a bit careful about that. I mention those because I think we need to be aware of the biases we've got coming into this. Okay, so let's have a second poll, if we may. Taking my 6 elements of judgment, I'd like to ask you, if I may, which of the following are you finding most difficult in these conditions? Those are the 6 elements: taking in, knowing what to do and trust, having enough information, feelings dominating choices, knowing if you've got the right options, knowing if I can carry through what I decide. The indication so far is that no single one of these dominates. And that, I think, is really very interesting because, it's not as if to say everybody's preoccupied by the same thing. There's a general thing throughout these that these are many different things that we're preoccupied by. I can tell you that the winner here is knowing whether I have the right options. In other words, making the choices. And I can understand that. That's, of course, inevitable that one feels, what exactly is the choice I'm going to make? Good, thank you very much. Again, that'll be useful in looking at the Q&A. Let me go on now to the question of applying all this to coronavirus territory. All right, so first of all, on taking things in, I think there's a danger that we may filter what we take in. In other words, we look at the information and we're quite selective about what we take in, perhaps going to the things where we feel more comfortable or more anxious, whatever it is. I think we have to be careful about the way in which we take in the information which we're getting and be aware of our mechanism that we might be filtering. Secondly, in terms of trusting, we know that people don't know, and it does seem to me there is a premium here. If people tell you, well, actually, I don't know what the answer is. At this stage, I can't give an answer to that question. That is honest. People who flannel their way through, I think, have got more of a problem. And in terms of saying, the way in which, for example, one talks to people one works with, I think it's worth being honest, because that seems to me is the way in which one comes across then as someone who is credible. We know about the dangers of fake news and social media and so on. We have to be careful about that. In terms of what we know about this, the key element here is, and that comes back to the chart I had earlier, that the longer this crisis goes on, the more we will know about it. It is going to be much easier to take decisions as time goes on than it is now. Indeed, it's easier now to take decisions than it was a week ago. If you think back 1-2 weeks, it feels like a different world. And that's because time actually gives us the benefit of having more information. On the feeling and belief, I think we have to be aware, as I mentioned, about where our biases are. It doesn't mean to say we're going to get rid of these biases, but it's helpful in making a judgment in saying, well, actually, I know I tend to do X or Y. I tend to listen to the last person who was talking to me or whatever it is, just to be aware of that in deciding then how you're going to make your choices. And also, one does have to have a sense of where is my risk tolerance in this. 5, we've got the question of choices, and as mentioned already, this will move as more is known. The choices will change because we will have more information to go on. Lastly, we've got the delivery element, and this is affected not just by what affects us, but also about all those secondary elements. What is happening to our customers? What's happening to our suppliers? What's happening to our colleagues? All these things are going to affect our ability to deliver. We may make the best choice, but actually be unable to do something simply because other things come in the way. This framework, it seems to me, is applicable to many different areas. If we think about the question, the very difficult issue, do you lay people off? Do you wait? These kinds of things. And for example, if we think about incentives, conventional incentives in many cases are out of the window. The issue now is survival in many cases, not, can we make a TSR target or whatever it is. So we have to be very aware of, in terms of dealing with our people, about this judgment framework. The priorities are something that we all have to get to grips with. How do we prioritize in these very new circumstances? We have to rethink an awful lot of things which we took for granted before. In terms of plans and strategy, I'm going to talk in a moment about plans. And Julian's, I know, is going to talk about strategy in a later part of this series. But we have to think about those pretty carefully. I'll come on to that as one of my examples. Projects. Most of us have got projects. Are those all on hold? Do we have to have them on hold to save money? Again, we need to rethink each of our projects in terms of thinking about the unknowns we've got to face. Performance measures, I'll come on to that too. Frankly, as I said, survival may be the issue here, no longer the targets we set out at the beginning of the year. And lastly, the question of what happens in a post-coronavirus world. Of course, we can see that home working is going to change an awful lot of attitudes in terms of what's possible. But we don't yet know how that will change more fundamentally. But if we just take education, our own field here at the London Business School, it's bound to change some aspects of that in terms of understanding what we can do. So those are the kinds of areas one can apply this framework in. I'd like to take 3 specifics, if I may. First of all, about what do I know? My suggestion here is push yourself along the timeline. In other words, if there are relevant facts and data available, try to make sure you know where they are and find them if you can. If I just give one example, there's an issue about face masks, all right? Should one wear a face mask or not? Well, actually, if you look on the WHO website, it seems to me some very clear advice about what face masks are good for and what they're not. In terms of the issues which you face, you are not the only person facing the problem you face now. There are many people in this country, all over the world, facing exactly the same problem. So my suggestion here is find others who are facing your problem. Even discussing it, I suggest here, is going to help in terms of sorting out your own feelings and understanding about what you might do. And I think you can think creatively about what that means in practice. There's a thing called creative benchmarking, which is not saying let's benchmark exactly, but let's benchmark the ideas or benchmark the processes, perhaps some very different kind of activities. So if I think, for example, about the emergency measures you take and how eventually, for goodness sake, how to go back to normal, everybody will be grappling with the same kinds of issues. If you can talk to other people, connect to other people, you don't have to face these things alone. So that's one example. The second one is about how I plan. And obviously, with maximum uncertainty, this is not the same as conventional terms. The first thing I think one has to do is to revisit one's appetite or tolerance for risk, in terms of saying, what am I prepared to do? Okay, here's a radical suggestion. You could argue that by now you should have scrapped the existing budgets, even if you're in an area which is relatively unaffected, because if you're unaffected, other people are still going to be affected by it. And arguably, you should be planning with new objectives and graded timescales. In other words, certain for a week, not very certain for 2 weeks, rather uncertain for 3 months. These are the kind of graded timescales I mean. And in a sense, one can do something. I've mentioned here rolling forecasts. You can roll those forward all the time. I think being realistic about how far you can plan ahead is a good thing. You cannot plan the future in these circumstances anything like the way you could a week ago, a month ago. And I think one should be explicit about the trade-offs. What are the trade-offs here between risk and the cost of doing something and the speed of doing something? Zero-based budgeting, for those in the field will know, is something where you scrap everything and start again from zero. That is pretty disruptive. But in some cases, you're going to have to do that because things are going to change fundamentally. And there's no use saying, well, it's just an extension of where we were before. Hopefully in not too many cases. In terms of planning ahead, I suggest you should look at uncertainty and how that's built into your projections. Are you clear about where the uncertainties are? For example, it may be unrealistic to say, let's have 1 point for the future. You might need a range rather than a midpoint. You need to check the assumptions you're making and other people are making. Look for evidence that's missing. And don't start planning grand scenarios for the next 6 months too early. That could be a bit of a waste of time. In the case of numerical models, frankly, the assumptions currently involved in your wonderful artificial intelligence equations may no longer be correct. So you may be operating with a set of assumptions on models which no longer apply. Please do check out to make sure that the kinds of assumptions you're making on the basis of these models actually are still relevant. And in terms of the planning, I think a question reasonably to ask yourself is, would I be prepared to defend what I'm doing now when this is all over? I think that's quite a good question to ask, just as a check. Third area, which are specific, is, and people I know are feeling, well, do I rely on my gut? This is a very common question when I've been talking about judgment more generally. And I've got these 4 books there, Malcolm Gladwell saying, yes, gut feeling is everything, and then towards the right people saying, no, it's not at all. All right, so do you rely on your gut feeling? Here are the questions I think you ought to answer before responding. Do you tend to act and then regret it? Have you got insufficient relevant data for this? Have you got insufficient relevant experience for this? And are the stakes high? These are 4 questions I think in any circumstances one should be asking oneself. And here my assumption is we don't have relevant experience and we probably don't have the relevant data now. Now, I'm not suggesting you should never rely on your gut, but I am suggesting you should think hard before relying on it. Okay, those are three practical examples of how to use this framework. But I hope the framework will be useful in many different occasions. Here's the summary and the kinds of things to bear in mind. I've mentioned filtering and in terms of listening and reading, trust, clarity on assumptions and on parallels. And, this is not the credit crisis and no country is exactly like China, just to be quite clear. In terms of feelings and beliefs and risk, be aware of those. Make sure your options aren't artificially limited and make sure you know in what timescale you can be operating. And look at the feasibility. Just be realistic about that. Here are 6 questions to ask yourself. This is the sort of summary of the framework that I've put up. These are the questions I believe one ought to ask oneself, whatever one comes in for difficult judgment territory. For those who want to know more, I wrote this up in a Harvard Business Review article, which came out in the January-February edition. There's the reference, and it'll be available too when this is made available after the event. You can look at the reasoning behind the way I've chosen these things and examples I give if you'd like to know more. Finally, can I just say, please do follow up with me. There's my email. I would very much like to share developments. I want to see how things are going and perhaps to look at this during the course of the crisis to see what more we at the London Business School can do. Thank you very much, Julian.
Thank you, Andrew. And if we could take the slides away, we'll move back to sort of a full-on picture of both of us. I think that will be very useful for the next, 20 minutes or so for the discussion. So I've been receiving a lot of questions, and I'm not going to, of course, get to all of them. A couple of you asked, first of all, how many people are on this? And the answer is more than 2,000, so a pretty big audience today. A couple of you also asking about, can we get copies of the slides? Can you tell us more about the books? And of course, Andrew's very kindly given us his email address, so feel free to get in touch with him. Be careful what you wish for. Yeah. And we will, of course, be sharing the video on the website in a couple of days. First question was actually directed at my intro, so let's just close that off. A couple of people said, look, surely pandemics are predictable, so they're in the category of known unknowns. And I think, Andrew, I mean, you may want to comment to this. My answer to that is, at some level, pandemics are predictable. In fact, every sort of scenario plan I've ever seen includes a number of these very low probability but high impact issues, such as pandemics, global nuclear war. The trouble is that putting that on a list of something which someone has imagined is very, very different to actually planning for it. So the fact that we're in a pandemic doesn't mean that somehow we got it wrong because we didn't plan for it, because all of these different things have taken so many different forms over the years. We've got to cope with the fact that this one is unique. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think you've said it very well, Julian.
Okay, let us move on to, I've got at least 6 categories of questions here. The biggest single category links, of course, to your framework, the sort of 6 different ways that one builds judgment. And the biggest single part of it is this issue around feelings versus, shall we say, objective data. People have said, look, many actions seem to be being based on gut. Judgments are subjective. It doesn't seem right that we should be making decisions in this way. I guess to specifically home in on the point that you ended with is, you said that this is not a good time to be relying on gut because these circumstances are unusual, because we don't have enough information. I guess I would just ask you to just say a little bit more about when can we rely on our gut? In other words, to what extent should we be allowing our intuition, whatever exactly that is, to help us? Yes, we take the point that we've got to use science and data as much as possible, but that's not going to get us all of the way there. When should we feel sort of courageous enough to allow the gut to take us to the last step?
Okay, so I make no mistake, I'm not saying gut feeling isn't a great thing, because I think it is. And in a lot of occasions, especially those in which we are familiar with the circumstances, gut feel generally seems to me to serve us really very well. In other words, we bring to mind very quickly as human beings all our accumulated knowledge and experience, and that is what our gut feel is. It isn't from the gut, actually. It's from here. It is all that accumulated knowledge and experience that comes out amazingly quickly. I mean, we are astonishing animals in that way. So I'm a strong believer in gut feel, no question at all about that. But this really is not a good moment to rely on gut feel, because we don't have that experience and we don't have the knowledge. And so it seems to me the essential elements of gut feel are not there.
So should we be, when we have this sort of gut reaction, should we be forcing ourselves to, shall we say, expose why we feel that? We're trying to almost go back and make sense of what is this prior experience that is causing me to think in that way. Is that
exactly? Right. And that's why, under any circumstances, I think it's a good idea not to say, I don't have any feelings about this. We all have feelings. We go into any decision taking in terms of any opinion which we form, our our feelings are there. Of course they are. They're part of us. What the main thing to do, as I suggest, is to acknowledge them and to understand where one's coming from, because that, it seems to me, is going to give one the best chance of making a good judgment.
Got it. So, second set of questions linked to the second poll. And if I remember rightly, 28% of the audience said, we don't feel we've got the right options to decide. 24%, we don't know who to trust. 22%, we haven't got enough information. I mean, it's a cry for help, right? In other words, it's like, we don't know what to do. This is an unprecedented situation. There's a risk, isn't there, of analysis paralysis, right? In other words, we want to just wait until we've got more information before we know what to do. And, setting aside the particularities of this case, as a general rule, analysis paralysis is not helpful. What's your advice, either general or specific, on overcoming analysis paralysis?
Well, I mentioned when I gave my framework that this is not about caution. It is not saying judgment is about not doing something, because we know in many cases not doing something is doing something. Right. The fact is, if you delay too long, it's too late. Right. And so there's no question in my mind that this is something that we have to bear in mind. It's interesting that all 6 of my elements came up in the poll, because I come back to it. You remember I said, right now, a lot of it is about judgment. And it is. All the elements of judgment are there. We are uncertain about so many elements of this, which is why it seems to me the judgment framework is potentially so important in terms of helping us to make those difficult choices. So, Julian, analysis paralysis, I'm no way saying that, this list ought to be looked at. I mean, frankly, if you've got to make a decision in 5 seconds, you've got to make it in 5 seconds. That's all you've got. That's right. But in those 5 seconds, I'm suggesting just think very quickly. Yeah. Do I know? Do I trust? Do I believe? What do I write? And so on. Yeah, and I'm just going to throw in my own observation on this, because I'm part of the team who at London Business School is planning and managing through this. And we've got huge questions about the future. That we cannot answer now. But what we can absolutely do is focus on the thing that we have to do right now, which is to make sure that all of our degree students are able to graduate by August. Yeah. And all of those planning meetings are all saying, what are the minimum steps we have to take to ensure that happens? We've got bigger issues to worry about later, but we simply cannot resolve them right now. Let's focus on so hopefully you think that's a good way of doing it. Of course. Good. How could you say anything else? Appreciate that. No. So question number 3. How have decision makers remained so ignorant of vital best practices to fight COVID-19 that have been experienced and actually done in some other countries, Korea, Taiwan, and so forth? Why aren't we building on those experiences? I mean, feel free to challenge the premise of the question, but it's a very fair question that there is genuine experience in the here and now from other countries. Take the UK. Are we doing the right things in that context? Well, I think we who are not part of that decision-taking process don't know. We do not know what evidence has been taken into account. Now, I think the question is a bit unfair, because my understanding from what I look at the announcements, I look at the newspapers, I look at the way in which politicians announce these things, and it seems to me they are, as far as I can see, taking into account what's going on somewhere else. I mean, they'd be, very silly not to do so. So I think the question, I say, is a bit unfair, because we don't know all the things that decision takers are taking into account. The fact that somebody is unconvinced means that, arguably there's a communication issue here. I mean, obviously we would all prefer to trust the politicians that they're making the right decisions and making the difficult choices in the light of the best information available. But, I mean, I come back to my suggestion, which is, in terms of the things that we do in our public lives and in our private lives, we need to make sure we have the best possible information. And there's a lot out there. I mean, all I can say is, I've been looking in the last few days. There's a lot of information available if you look for it. Perfect. Good. So I want to go back to the very first poll that you did. And the bottom line there was 62% of people
worry about how long it will last, the biggest single worry. And that's a fascinating issue to think about, isn't it? I'd like your comments on that. I mean, it seems to me that, on the one hand, we want to be optimistic about surely this crazy time will come to an end soon. We've also got to be realistic about the possibility it carries on for a long time. And I guess as social animals, we like to plan for our futures and figure out what we're going to do next. All of that is on hold. How should we think about that? How should we try to plan when we can't plan?
Well, if you remember, my suggestion was that what we should do is have a timescale for planning which is appropriate to the information which we've got. So we don't plan very far into the future if there's no basis for doing that. I mean, what we can do is to make sure that in the short term we're doing the right things, if necessary, to have the options available for us to take good decisions later on. So we don't close off options for us for later on. Yeah. So I think we can respond appropriately to the information which is available to us. So, I don't have anything more to say than that, other than to say that I think if we don't know something, let us say we don't know, and we're waiting for further information to enable us to make a more informed decision.
Right. No, that's right. And you and I were discussing before we got started, and of course, it is tempting to try to have a ready answer to every question. There are times, and this is one of them, where we actually should just simply say, we do not know. Yeah. We need more information. So that is those of you who live in the UK. Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, said yesterday, in 12 weeks. We will be through this, or I forget his exact words. He didn't say exactly what he meant by 12 weeks, but it was fascinating to me that he gave us a planning horizon, because 12 weeks is somehow close enough that we can get our heads around it. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting because at the press conference, which the Prime Minister held yesterday, a journalist got onto this pretty quickly and said, well, what exactly is going to happen in 12 weeks, which of course is absolutely right. And I've, heard a comment saying, well, it isn't, the beginning of the end, it's still the end of the beginning, maybe in 3 months' time. So I think we can all feel more cheerful that there's a 3-month time horizon potentially for this, which is great. But actually, we don't know what's going to be happening in 3 months' time. And I suspect, although of course I may be wrong, neither does the Prime Minister.
Indeed. There have been a few questions about him in particular, but I want to keep this international. Yeah. So we're going to keep comments about Boris Johnson or other world leaders off the conversation right now, if that's okay. So, question number 5. Do you believe social media has exploded this monster out of proportions? Does Facebook reinforce our biases?
Well, I think it depends how much you look at social media. I'm not a great social media fan in terms of where I get my information. But I've already been, it's very interesting. Somebody yesterday, a doctor actually, sent me a little about an email explaining about this virus. And he passed on saying, here's some very good information. He then sent me something an hour later saying, this is fake news. This was sent to me as fake news.
Oh my gosh.
So you can see, these are times when one has to be really pretty careful. Some people rely more on social media and some less. If you've got great social media, I think that's fine. I'm cautious. Again, if people say they know, it's quite unlikely, it seems to me, that they do in these circumstances.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. And for what it's worth, we've all seen that social media allows our biases to be reinforced because it, of course, gives us a feed that's based on the stuff that we have clicked on before. It is fascinating to me that I am getting a lot of scientific stuff coming through my Facebook feed. But what I do not know, of course, is whether others are getting that scientific stuff, or perhaps that's because of the stuff I click on. I'd like to think that in these times of crisis, people are trying to be a little bit more rational and scientific about the situation we're facing. Here's a nice question. This is a very generic question, but you can apply it to the specifics if you like. How candid should one be when making a judgment call that you're uncertain about? In other words, as a leader, you're standing up, you have made a judgment, there's some rationality there, but there's some intuition. To what extent do you have to present this as somehow this is the right answer, or can you bring some of your uncertainty out in terms of what you communicate?
I think this is a great question, and I think this is one of the things, surely, that marks a very good leader, right, which is someone who can communicate the fact that they understand the situation, but there are uncertainties attached to it. And having that very delicate balance does seem to me an element of good judgment in leadership. Now, every situation is different. You can't simply say, what should one do in general? Because it's going to depend on the circumstances, on what you know and what you don't know in each case. But can I just make a suggestion? Look at the way in which people make announcements now and say to yourself, do I trust this person? What is it seems to me they actually know and don't know? And if you want guidance about what to do and not to do, just watch other people and think to yourself, do I believe this? Because if you don't believe it, then that's a pretty good guide they've got something wrong. So I would take examples of that kind.
No, and indeed it is suddenly in these crisis times when it's often said, isn't it, leader comes to a fore, leader shows their true soul at the time of a crisis, and we start to see who comes across as authentic and who comes across as false or forced. Yeah. And we can see this. We've got many examples that are coming through our Twitter feeds as we speak. Good. So thank you. A couple more questions, and we're going to close in about 3 or 4 minutes. And these may be in the category of things that you can't answer. Someone says, what's your advice on a career change at this time of crisis? And I'm going to link that to another question, which is equally challenging. Are there investment opportunities that should we be thinking about right now?
I've lived too long to answer a question like that as saying, there's a great investment opportunity, just listen to me, this is what it is, or this is definitely how you should change your career. In both cases, this is something which is very much a question of the individual and indeed, the issue of how much risk you're prepared to take in these circumstances. I'm sure there will be opportunities, ironically, even in these times for a number of people, and things will emerge that would not have emerged in any other way, just as investment opportunities will emerge. But I'm afraid I'm not so clever or so rash as to advise people about whether they should put their money now.
Good. Okay, we're closing shortly. Thank you for a fantastic talk, sir. How do we consider the role of government in decision-making? And I want to just pick up on one specific part of that, because you worked in government. Yeah. You had a very significant role in the UK government. Just give us a thought on the difference, if you like, between private sector and public sector decision-making processes, particularly in crisis times.
Well, the key element for those in the public sector is about risk. The fact is that in the public sector, it's not symmetric. There is a big minus in taking a risk and getting it wrong, and there's not necessarily a big plus in taking a risk and getting it right. That's one thing I would point to straight away. But the circumstances are very, very different here. And in terms of saying what's the difference between public and private sector, this is a huge subject, Julian, and I'm slightly cautious about taking it here. All I can say is that, having served in the UK public sector, I know that the people there will be doing everything they can to try and help the country through the crisis. So, I've got a huge respect for the people who work in the public sector, and I'm sure they'll be doing their best for the rest of us.
Good. So let's move to that final slide, if we could. We are going to close, and I'm not going to attempt to summarize our conversation, but I will actually be doing exactly that in a posting that I will do. I put it out on LinkedIn, but we'll also link it to the website. So please take a look at the slide in front of you. You will see that lengthy website name at the bottom, london.edu Campaigns Executive Education Pandemic Webinars. On that website, you will find at the top a list of the upcoming webinars. And the very next one is on Tuesday next week. Nero Sivanathan is a colleague who works in our organizational behavior group. He's going to be talking about negotiating losses in times of crisis. And if you go to the bottom of that webpage, what you will find is videos and resources and links to all of the websites, or the webinars rather, that have happened already. So feel free to go onto that website. Feel free to share that with your friends. We're going to be using it essentially as a place where all of London Business School's thinking on these issues is going to be collected. So with that, I'm going to suggest that we close. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your very thoughtful analysis of decision-making in coronavirus times. Thank you all for attending, and we will see you all next time on Tuesday. Bye-bye.